My name is Marissa Cole. I am 37, and last Christmas Eve, my sister-in-law stood behind me, poured red wine down my dress, and called me trash while my family laughed in silence. What they never expected was that the woman they humiliated was the same woman who kept their empire alive, who held the passwords, the contracts, and the law on her side. That night, I logged in, signed my name, and emptied every cent from the accounts they thought were untouchable. By the time the snow melted in Denver, their house was sold, their empire gone, and all that remained was the echo of their silence. Snow squeaked under my boots as I climbed the front steps of my parents' house in Denver, a bottle of Cabernet tucked against my coat. Warm light spilled across the porch, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves hit me the second the door opened. The living room looked like a catalog page. White lights braided through the banister stockings, lined in perfect symmetry, the tree dressed in glass ornaments we had collected one by one, when Daniel and I were still small enough to fight over who got to place the star. Beauty did what it could. It could not lift the weight in the air. My mother Margaret swept in lipstick, flawless pearls catching the light. She took the bottle from my hands and thanked me, already craning toward the foyer where the real event was due to arrive. My father, Richard, stood at the end of the dining table, smoothing the linen runner with two careful palms, the same quiet ritual he used whenever conversation threatened to turn real. He nodded at me, then returned to aligning silverware until it sat at soldier angles. A gust of cold and laughter followed Daniel through the door. He shook snow from his coat with the confidence of someone who expects an audience, then ushered Rachel in on his arm. They were curated, polished, her sequined dress throwing tiny stars across the ceiling as she moved. Rachel set her clutch near the head of the table like a flag planted in new territory. Daniel called out greetings, soaking in the warmth that gathered around him, the way a bonfire collects bodies on a winter night. I hung my coat and stepped into the dining room. Candles flickered in low glass holders. My mother hovered near Daniel, fingers adjusting an already straight tie, voice bright with questions about his upcoming contract. When she turned toward me, the brightness dimmed to a soft neutral. She asked how work at Cole Properties was going, the way people ask about traffic. Certain there is nothing surprising in the answer. I said it was steady, then asked if she needed help in the kitchen. She told me everything was handled. We took our seats. China clinked softly, ham steamed at the center, and conversation drifted around the edges of safe topics. An aunt commented on the weather coming down from the mountains. A cousin asked Daniel about a potential expansion to Boulder, his tone admiring. Rachel rested one perfectly manicured hand on Daniel's sleeve and surveyed the room with the calm satisfaction of a ringmaster before the first trick. When her eyes landed on me, they did not soften. My phone buzzed against my thigh, a check-in from Lucas. A simple, "Enjoy your mom's rolls, breathe. I love you." I powered the screen dark and straightened my napkin. Across the table, my father lifted a bottle and asked if anyone needed more wine. He poured for Rachel first. The red caught the candlelight garnet and glossy. She raised her glass a fraction, testing the weight, then let it hover mid-air. My mother tapped her water glass with a fork to gather attention for a toast. Daniel leaned back, ready to speak, but Rachel cut a clean line through the noise with her voice. She said she hoped no one embarrassed the family this time the way some people always did. She did not look at me when she said some people. She did not need to. Eyes followed the words to where they were meant to land. Conversation thinned to a thread and snapped. Heat moved up my throat. I reached for my glass, took a short swallow, and set it down before the taste could turn. A cousin coughed into his napkin. At the far end of the table, an uncle tried a joke about the Broncos and trailed off when no one picked it up. My mother lifted her brows in a warning I knew well and told everyone to be gracious. It was Christmas, let us keep things pleasant. Pleasant had always been code for quiet. Quiet had always been assigned to me. Daniel looked toward the centerpiece and away from the wreckage beside him. He patted Rachel's hand, a soft approval, then cleared his throat and started a new thread about ski passes. The room obliged. The sound lifted a notch, brittle and artificial, like wrapping paper torn and smoothed again, as if creases could be erased with effort. Rachel leaned back, the sequins at her shoulder glittering. She watched me for a beat with polite curiosity, then let her gaze drop to my dress. She tilted her glass a hair, swirling the Cabernet until a dark ring lapped the rim. The motion was lazy practiced. A smear of red light slid across the white cloth toward my plate. My mother saw the movement and chose a different view, reaching for the cranberry sauce, asking if anyone wanted more. My father shifted the salt and pepper 1 inch to the left. I sat up straighter and folded my hands in my lap. I could feel the old training rise in my chest, the one that says make yourself smaller. Take the hit. Keep the peace. It pressed against my ribs, and I breathed through it until the pressure thinned. I met Rachel's eyes across the candles. She held my stare, then let the corner of her mouth curl in a smile that was almost kind, and not kind at all. The room carried on at its careful volume. A chair scraped, a fork nicked porcelain. Outside, snow tapped the window like a patient finger. Rachel shifted her chair closer to Daniel, then closer still to me. Her bracelet chimed against the stem of the glass. The red surface trembled, Rose steadied. The first drop clung to the lip as if undecided. I felt the table tighten around the moment, every person pretending not to notice and noticing all the same. My mother's hands flattened on the tablecloth. Daniel's jaw worked a tick he gets when he wants to be anywhere else. The flame nearest me bent in the draft of Rachel's movement and held. I placed my palms on the edge of the table, every muscle quiet, and waited. Snow clung to the window panes while the voices at the table hummed around me. Rachel shifted her chair back, the sequins on her dress scattering shards of light across the ceiling. I thought she was reaching for the butter dish. Instead, she rose, her wineglass in hand, and stepped behind me. The cold splash hit first sharp as ice, soaking through the fabric of my dress. A gasp broke from somewhere down the table. Crimson spread across the pale cloth clinging to my lap, blooming like an accusation. The scent of Cabernet clung to me, sour and heavy. My chair screeched against the hardwood as I jerked back in shock. Rachel's laugh was low, deliberate. She leaned close enough that I felt her breath on my ear. "You are trash," she said, clear and sharp, "and you don't deserve a place in this family." Her words cut cleaner than the wine. No one moved. No one stopped her. A cousin's fork hovered midair, frozen above his plate. My mother's hand fluttered nervously as she whispered, "It is only wine? Dear, do not make this into a scene." Daniel slid an arm around Rachel's shoulder and pulled her back to his side like she had told a clever joke. He even chuckled, as though humiliation could be disguised as entertainment. Heat surged in my face, but I stayed still. My fingers tightened against the edge of the table. My heart thudded so hard it seemed to echo in the silence. The wine seeped into my skin, sticky cold, yet I forced myself not to wipe at it, not to give them that satisfaction. An aunt cleared her throat, trying to bridge the crack with a comment about the snowstorm coming tomorrow. No one replied. Even my father, still adjusting the salt shaker, never lifted his eyes from the table. Their silence pressed heavier than Rachel's insult. I breathed slowly, every inhale a fight against the burn in my chest. Inside me, the words churned, the scream, the demand, the truth I wanted to throw across the room. But they stayed caged. To answer her here would mean giving them what they expected, the scene they could laugh about tomorrow. So I sat. I let the fabric of my dress cling tighter as it dried each second, branding me with their dismissal. My jaw ached from holding it shut. My eyes blurred, but never spilled. I wanted someone, anyone, to say, "This is wrong," but no voice came. Rachel leaned into Daniel again, her smile sharp, her glass now empty, the rim still wet with what she had stolen from my dignity. My mother busied herself with passing dishes no one touched. A cousin whispered at the far end, then went quiet. I stared at the flicker of the candle, its flame trembling in the draft like it might vanish. In that flame, I saw the truth I had spent years trying not to believe. They would never defend me. They would never choose me. The laughter started again, thin and artificial conversation stumbling forward on brittle legs. I tasted blood where I had bitten the inside of my cheek. My hands remained folded in my lap, though every muscle screamed to run. In that moment, I felt myself erased, not just from the table, but from the story they told about who belonged. The tree glittered in the living room, gifts piled high, yet none of it felt like mine. I was a ghost in my own house, marked with red for everyone to see. I lowered my gaze to the stained cloth spreading across my lap, and breathed once steady, until the noise around me blurred. The decision to stay quiet burned like fire in my throat, but I knew silence now was not surrender. It was storage. And as Rachel lifted her glass again to call for another toast, I felt something harden deep inside me. The night was far from over, and so was I. I carried the weight of that moment home with me, the scent of wine still clinging to my skin long after I had scrubbed it away. As I sat in the quiet of my living room, the Christmas lights glowing faintly in the window, memories began to surface like old photographs I had tried to bury. I was 8 when I first understood what it meant to be compared. Daniel was 6, a mess of scraped knees and half-finished chores, yet every stumble he made was treated like charm. He could forget his lines in a school play, and the whole family laughed, called him adorable, bought him ice cream on the way home. When I brought home a perfect score on a spelling test, my mother nodded once and asked if I had helped Daniel with his homework. The applause never landed in my direction. By the time I was in high school, the pattern had hardened. I graduated top of my class, earned a scholarship to the University of Colorado, and my parents skipped the ceremony because Daniel had a baseball scrimmage. I stood in the parking lot in my cap and gown, while my best friend's family handed me flowers, pretending not to care that my own parents had chosen aluminum bleachers over me. The sting never really faded. It just taught me silence. Silence followed me into adulthood. I earned my MBA at Stanford, worked through nights of case studies and internships, and when I called home to share the news of my acceptance, my mother said that Daniel had just gotten a promotion at his sales job, and wasn't that wonderful? At family dinners, I would sit across from relatives who asked Daniel about his goals, his plans, his dreams, while I cleared plates and listened. I was useful, not celebrated. Even in the company my father founded, I was tucked behind the curtain. When the recession hit in 2010 and Cole Properties teetered on the edge of collapse, I was the one who negotiated with banks, reorganized budgets, convinced investors to hold on just a little longer. I slept under my desk more times than I can count. Daniel showed up at board meetings with a fresh haircut and a borrowed speech, and my mother told everyone how proud she was of his leadership. My name never made it into the minutes. It was around that time I met Lucas. I had been invited to a networking event in Denver, another cold room where men with tailored suits circled each other like chess pieces. I was standing by the buffet table rehearsing the answer to yet another question about whether I was Daniel's assistant when Lucas struck up a conversation. He asked about my work, but not the glossy version. He asked what kept me awake at night, what made me stay when it would have been easier to walk away. I remember blinking because no one had ever asked me that before. We started with coffee, then long walks on winter nights where he let me talk without interrupting, without minimizing, without glancing over my shoulder for someone more important. He saw me, not the shadow I had been trained to inhabit. He told me once that quiet strength was the rarest kind, and I held on to those words in the years that followed. When I came home from another dinner, where Daniel had been showered with praise for closing a deal I had actually structured, Lucas would pour me a glass of wine, sit with me on the couch, and remind me that truth does not need applause to exist. Still, the ache lingered. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, I watched my parents beam at Daniel's stories while I stacked dishes in the kitchen. I told myself it was easier that way, easier to carry the burden alone than to demand recognition that would never come. But tonight, sitting with the memory of red wine dripping down my dress while Rachel called me trash, and no one lifted a finger, the old wounds opened wider. I thought of the hours I had spent holding that family together, the sacrifices buried so deep no one even remembered them. I thought of Daniel laughing beside Rachel, choosing her cruelty over my dignity. And I thought of my mother's soft dismissal, as if humiliation could be folded neatly away like napkins after dessert. For the first time, I did not feel sadness. I felt clarity. Silence was no longer armor, it was fuel. They had shown me exactly where I stood in their story, and it was nowhere. The memory of Lucas's voice echoed in my mind. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it is knowing when to wait. I sat back against the couch, the glow of the Christmas tree reflecting in the darkened window, and I knew the waiting was almost over. Because what Rachel had poured on me tonight was not just wine. It was the last drop in a glass already full, and the spill would not be mine to clean. The week before Christmas, I had stayed late at the Cole Properties office, combing through quarterly reports that never seemed to add up. The numbers looked clean on the surface, but the margins kept shifting in ways that did not match the contracts I had signed. I pulled up the internal banking records, the kind of detail most executives never bother to review, and that was when I saw it. Transfers small enough to avoid scrutiny funneled into an account that did not belong to the company. The account names were clear: Daniel Cole and Rachel Cole. My pulse hammered as I scrolled through line after line. It had been happening for months, masked as miscellaneous distributions. They had siphoned close to $400,000 in less than a year. It was not just sloppy bookkeeping, it was theft. And it was theft under my watch because I was the one who had signed the partnership agreement giving me equal authority with Daniel. I leaned back in my chair, the Denver skyline stretching dark beyond the frosted glass. For a long moment, I just stared at the numbers. Then I opened my phone and called Helena Ross. She picked up on the second ring, her voice calm, and clipped the way only an experienced finance attorney can manage. I walked her through everything line by line until my voice shook from reading the totals. She asked me to forward the files, then silence stretched as she reviewed. When she spoke again, her words were steady but carried weight. "You realize what this means, Marissa. These accounts are in breach of the operating agreement. Legally, you have full authority to reclaim the funds." I gripped the arm of my chair. "You mean I could take it all?" "You could?" She confirmed. "The joint family trust holds $2.5 million, and the operating account of Cole Properties currently carries about $1.2 million. You are a named co-owner on both. Daniel and Rachel moved money without disclosure. That is grounds enough for immediate action. If you wanted to pull every cent tomorrow, you would be entirely within your rights." I closed my eyes, remembering the wine dripping down my dress, Rachel's voice calling me trash, Daniel laughing at her side. My throat tightened. For years I had swallowed the humiliation, convinced myself silence was survival. But silence had bought them time to steal from me. Helena's voice softened. "I know you. You do not make reckless decisions. If you want to move, do it carefully, and know this will not be something you can take back." I thanked her and ended the call, my fingers trembling as I closed the laptop. The office around me felt cold, sterile, but in that moment I realized I was not powerless. I had leverage they did not expect. Driving home through the snowy streets, I kept seeing Rachel's smirk at the dinner table. I heard my mother's voice excusing it, my father's silence, the same chorus I had heard my entire life. But now, beneath the humiliation, there was a new current. Not rage, but clarity. When I walked through my front door, Lucas was waiting in the kitchen, a mug of tea steaming on the counter. He looked up, concern etched across his face. "Long day." I slid the printed statements across the counter. "You have no idea." He read in silence, his jaw tightening with every page. When he finished, he set them down and met my eyes. "They really thought you would never notice." I let out a sharp breath. They thought I would keep cleaning up after them forever. Lucas reached across, took my hand and squeezed it once. "Then maybe it is time to stop cleaning." I sat down heavily, the weight of years pressing on me, but not crushing me. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something shifting. For the first time, I was not just the quiet one, the reliable one. I was the one holding the keys to their future. The snow kept falling outside, soft and endless, covering the city in silence. Inside me, though, the noise of their betrayal roared, and beneath that roar, a plan was starting to form. When I walked through the door that night, the house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the furnace. I peeled off my coat, still smelling faintly of smoke from the fireplace at my parents' house, and looked down at my dress. The stain had dried into a wide crimson shadow that no scrubbing would ever erase. I let it hang heavy against me as I set my bag on the counter and powered up my laptop. Lucas came from the kitchen holding a mug of tea. His eyes traveled over me and stopped at the stain. He set the mug down carefully. "You do not have to keep carrying this," he said softly. "You do not need to let them use you like this anymore. Take back what is yours." The screen glowed in the dim room as I typed in my credentials: Cole Properties, Family Trust, Personal Authentication. Each portal opened with a familiar series of security prompts. My fingers moved automatically, but my pulse hammered harder with each click. I pulled up the balances. 2.5 million in the family trust, 1.2 million in the operating account. Together they looked obscene on the screen numbers that had been pulled and twisted without a second thought, while I was expected to sit at the table, smiling through humiliation. I picked up my phone and tapped Helena's name. The video call connected, and her face appeared framed by the warm light of her office lamp, even at this late hour. I showed her my screen, walked her through the steps I was about to take. She nodded once and said, "I will send you a confirmation letter right now. A signed statement making clear that as co-owner, you have every legal right to move these funds." She leaned forward until her expression filled the frame. "If you choose to do this, Marissa, there will be no turning back." My voice did not waver. "There is nothing to go back to." An email pinged moments later, the PDF attached. I opened it, scanned the lines of legal language, then pressed my digital signature into place. The file saved automatically sealed like a contract with myself. Lucas stood behind me now, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You are not doing this out of spite," he said. "You are doing it because they forced you to." I nodded, then returned to the keyboard. I initiated the transfer from the family trust first. A prompt appeared asking me to verify with a passcode sent to my phone. The code arrived instantly. My hands trembled as I typed it in, each digit falling like a hammer strike. Confirm. Another screen appeared warning me of the irreversible nature of the action. I pressed accept. The bar inched forward until the confirmation flashed green. Transfer complete. I exhaled, but there was no relief, only momentum. I opened the operating account next. Again the passcode again, the warning again, the final button. My finger hovered for a long moment, then pressed down. The screen blinked and settled. Balance 0. Funds secured. For years I had been the one patching holes, shifting money, begging investors to wait just a little longer. Tonight I watched as millions moved in silence at my command. Every keystroke felt like cutting a rope that had bound me since childhood. The room was quiet, except for the steady buzz of the furnace and the faint scratch of Lucas's thumb against my shoulder. The stain on my dress darkened in the glow of the screen, an ugly reminder and a perfect symbol. I closed the laptop slowly and looked at Lucas. His eyes searched mine not for doubt, but for the cost of what I had just done. I steadied my breath. They thought I would always be the one cleaning up their mess. Outside, the snow had thickened into white sheets across the street lamps, muffling the city. Inside me, the noise had gone quiet for the first time in years. It was not peace, not yet, but the silence of something inevitable waiting to break. The phone began ringing just after dawn, the vibration rattling against my nightstand, until I finally turned it face down. By the third call, I saw my mother's name flashing across the screen, then Daniel's, then Rachel's in frantic succession. I did not answer. I walked into the kitchen, poured coffee, and let the silence hold. By mid-morning, the calls had turned into voicemails. I let the first one play on speaker while I buttered toast. Daniel's voice cracked between fury and panic. "What did you do, Marissa? The accounts are empty. This is criminal. Call me back right now." I deleted it before it finished. Another message followed, Rachel's voice sharp and unsteady. "You think this is funny? You ruined us. Do you understand what you've done?" Her words collapsed into a scream before the recording cut out. The last one came from my mother. Her voice was low, trembling, but no less pointed. "Marissa, this is your family. You cannot possibly believe this is justified. Put the money back before you destroy everything your father built." I could hear clinking dishes in the background, then a muffled sob that did not sound like regret, only fear. Later, I heard what unfolded in that house. Rachel pacing the kitchen, mascara streaked, throwing her phone against the wall until it cracked. Daniel slamming his fist into the dining table so hard the dishes shook. My mother standing near the fireplace, pointing her finger in every direction but never once at them. My father sat in his armchair with his head bowed, his silence louder than their shouting. It was chaos inside those walls. Rachel cried that her cards were being declined already. Daniel swore that I had ruined Christmas, ruined his marriage, ruined his life. My mother demanded that I be dragged back into line, as if obedience was still possible. And through it all, my father said nothing. His shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Daniel, you can't get away with this. Rachel, we'll take you to court. My mother. Please, Marissa, do not do this to us. I typed slowly, deliberately, and sent one reply to all three. I have taken back what belongs to me. It is legal. It is final. Do not call again. I set the phone down and watched the screen stay dark. For the first time in my life, they had no leverage left. Their money was mine, their control severed. What remained was their rage, and rage was powerless without fuel. Lucas stepped into the kitchen, hair still mussed from sleep. He picked up the phone, read the messages, and handed it back to me without a word. Instead, he kissed the top of my head and poured himself coffee. That small act, the absence of panic, was more grounding than any speech could have been. By afternoon, a new name appeared on my screen: Maggie Turner. We had once shared late nights in college libraries, her hunched over journalism drafts while I wrestled with finance cases. We had lost touch over the years, but she had followed my family's company from a distance. Her message was simple. Heard something brewing at Cole Properties. Want to talk? I stared at the words for a long moment. Maggie had always been relentless in her pursuit of the truth, sharp enough to see through polite veneers. If she was reaching out now, it meant whispers had already left the house. I typed back, "Meet me tomorrow." I set the phone face down again. Outside, the snow was still falling, blanketing Denver in white silence, but inside, I knew the storm had only just begun. 3 days later, the whispers had turned into headlines. Cole Properties faces internal financial rift. A reporter from the Denver Post called my office asking for comment. I declined, but I knew where the story had come from. Maggie had asked me one careful question at a coffee shop and left with enough truth in my silence to dig for herself. The annual year-end gala at the Denver Business Hall was usually the highlight of the city's corporate season. Rows of tables covered in crystal and linen champagne towers, reaching higher than the centerpieces, a room full of contracts disguised as conversations. I had skipped the event this year, but Rachel and Daniel had not. They needed the spotlight too much to stay home, even with rumors buzzing like hornets around them. I heard about the unraveling later from 3 different sources. The evening began with the usual posturing. Daniel shaking hands, Rachel brushing cheeks with women in gowns that cost more than rent. My mother, Margaret, perched at their table in silver satin, her laugh pitched too high, trying to pretend the family was still untouchable. My father sat beside her shoulders, bent his eyes fixed on the rim of his glass. Halfway through the evening, Phoebe Lane, a young journalist with a sharp eye and a quicker phone, began posting live updates. Her captions were merciless. Daniel Cole greets guests as rumors swirl of missing funds. Rachel Cole dazzling in sequins, despite whispers of legal trouble. The posts spread across social media in real time, shared and dissected, until the air in the ballroom turned brittle. Then came the blow. A banking executive stood to announce that his firm would be suspending negotiations with Cole Properties until further notice. Another followed, citing reputational risk. Contracts that had taken Daniel months to parade in front of investors crumbled in the span of minutes. Applause never followed his attempts to reassure. Instead, silence wrapped the room, the kind of silence that means everyone knows the truth, but no one will say it aloud. Rachel's voice carried above the quiet, sharp and desperate. "We are fine. This is temporary. My husband has everything under control." She turned to Daniel with a smile that cracked at the edges, but the crowd was already pulling away, chairs scraping, conversations shifting toward other tables. Margaret stood clutching her pearls, insisting it was a misunderstanding. She spoke of family loyalty, of temporary setbacks, but her words fell like stones in water. No one reached to pull her up. Richard never moved his head, still bowed, his silence now resembling shame. Phoebe posted again. "The Coles once ran Denver real estate with quiet dominance. Tonight the silence feels different. Tonight it feels like an ending." I sat in my apartment scrolling through the updates, the glow of my phone painting the room in cold light. Every photo, every caption, every murmured comment was another thread snapping loose. I pictured Rachel's face as people turned from her the same way she had once turned the entire table against me with a single cruel sentence. Only now the stage was larger, the lights brighter, the humiliation impossible to hide. Lucas watched me from across the couch. "You did not even have to open your mouth," he said quietly. "They did this themselves." I set the phone down, my chest steady. For years I had carried their weight. Now I watched them collapse under the weight of their own choices. Outside the snow had melted into slush, but the chill in the air promised more storms ahead. I knew this was not the end. The collapse inside a ballroom was only the beginning of what still needed to be done. A week later, the snow had thinned into gray slush along the Denver sidewalks, but inside our apartment, the air felt lighter than it had in years. Lucas sat across from me with a cup of coffee while I opened my laptop. A new email notification blinked at the top of my screen. It was from Helena. Her message was concise but final. "All transactions completed. All transfers verified. As co-owner, you hold full legal authority over the accounts. No further dispute can be filed." I read the words twice, then leaned back in my chair. My body relaxed for the first time since Christmas Eve. The silence around me did not feel empty anymore. It felt like space I had carved out of fire. Lucas watched me waiting. I met his eyes and nodded once. "It is done." News trickled in over the following days. Daniel and Rachel listed their house in Cherry Creek, forced to sell before the bank could seize it. The cars went next, then the designer furniture Rachel had filled the rooms with. They had burned through favors too quickly. People who once praised them stopped returning calls. Partners who had smiled for photos cut ties publicly. Their empire of appearances crumbled brick by brick. My mother left 2 voicemails I never returned. The first begged, the second accused. My father never called at all. I imagined him still in his armchair watching the walls fall around him, too quiet to stop anything, too proud to admit what silence had cost. Maggie texted one evening as I folded laundry. She had covered the story carefully, focusing on the legal facts rather than family names, but she still wrote to me privately. "You did the right thing. Sometimes justice is heavy, but it is still justice." I stared at her words for a long moment before replying simply, "Thank you." Later that night, I opened my closet and pulled out the dress I had worn to the dinner table. The wine stain was gone, the fabric clean, but I could still feel the weight of that night in its folds. I hung it on the door and studied it under the dim light. A piece of clothing, nothing more, yet it had become a marker. The night humiliation was poured on me like a performance, the night I finally stopped being quiet. Lucas came behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. His chin rested on my shoulder, his voice low. "You look different when you stand next to it. Stronger." I touched the fabric one last time and whispered more to myself than to him. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it moves in silence, but the echo lasts forever. The next morning, I opened the window to let in the winter air. The city below was waking, cars sliding through slush, people bundled in coats, each carrying their own unseen battles. For the first time in decades, mine was no longer hidden. It was finished, and I was free to step into a life defined by my own choices rather than theirs. The story was no longer about what they had taken from me. It was about what I had finally taken back.